I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, coming at you with a special episode because the Jets have a new general manager. It is Broncos assistant GM Darren Mougey who will replace Joe Douglas running the Jets front office. And in many ways, this feels like the most anticlimactic conclusion to a Jets general manager search in history because when the Jets hired Joe Douglas and when the Jets hired Mike McCagnon and when the Jets hired John Idzik, fans were at the edge of their seats because these were the people who were going to be in charge of the organization. This time, it doesn't feel like the GM's really the guy in charge. It feels like the guy the Jets really invested in was Aaron Glenn, the new head coach. And the new GM is really going to be tasked with implementing Aaron Glenn's vision. And you look across the league, there are all sorts of different models teams utilize. There are some teams like Dallas and Cincinnati where the owner is very much the person in charge. Then there are teams where the GM has a lot to say, where the GM is really the point person for everything the team does. I think the Jets are going with a model where the head coach is really the person in charge. And if you go back a few weeks on this podcast, and if you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. A few weeks back, it felt like Mike Vrabel was the front runner for the Jets head coaching job. And at that point, there were rumors that he'd want to bring in an executive named Ryan Cowden, who he had worked with the Tennessee Titans. And at that point, what I said was, if I was looking for a situation where the GM was the guy in charge, where this was the point person, Cowden would not even be on my list. But if you're going to a more of a model where the head coach is the guy who's running things, and the GM's job is really to be tasked with implementing the head coach's vision. And you see that across the league. I mean, that was the model Seattle had for many years, where John Schneider, the general manager, was focused on implementing what Pete Carroll wanted to do. I think you could argue with the San Francisco 49ers. That's kind of the way they do things. When Kyle Shanahan was hired, he brought in John Lynch. John Lynch was his guy because he felt like John Lynch was the guy who would build that team up. And I feel like that's going to be the role for Mougey around Aaron Glenn. If the Jets were looking for a strong general manager, if the Jets were looking for the GM to run everything, then I don't even know that Mougey would be a guy that would be all that interesting. But when Aaron Glenn was hired, and it sounds like the Jets are giving Aaron Glenn a pretty substantial contract to come here, it really felt like the Jets got him because they think he's the next coaching superstar. And we certainly hope that they're right because the Jets really need to turn this thing around sooner rather than later. The question is, can he and Mougey work together? That's really what this comes down to. And there was a lot of speculation that Lance Newmark would be the guy the Jets ended up hiring if they brought in Glenn, because Newmark has extensive experience working with Aaron Glenn. The two of them were with the Lions organization for 3 years together. It's difficult to say what happened because it felt like early in the week, Glenn and Newmark were the first two candidates to receive second-round interviews with the team. Newmark was the first general manager candidate to get a second interview. Glenn was the first head coaching candidate to get a second interview. Of course, what happened was Glenn got the job off the second interview, and the Jets decided to go in a different direction. So I don't know, maybe Newmark didn't do things as well. I think the real hope for this is that Glenn played a prominent role in this hire. There's no obvious ties between Glenn and Mougey. Mougey spent his entire front office career with the Denver Broncos. He started as an intern in 2012, worked his way up to a personnel and scouting assistant, became a scout, then the assistant director of college scouting, the director of player personnel, the assistant general manager. There's no evidence that he and Glenn have worked together in the past, but that's not necessarily a deal breaker. You can work really well with somebody. Past experience working with somebody isn't a prerequisite to working well together, to working effectively together. My real hope here is that the Jets decide to let Glenn get his guy. And maybe, it's easy to speculate maybe Lance Newmark was Glenn's guy because they worked together, but that's not always the case. Even though Glenn and Mougey haven't worked together, it's possible they've crossed paths in the past, or it's possible just during the interview process, Mougey really blew them away. But ultimately, it's not about finding the guy who has the flashiest resume, because 5 years ago, the guy with the flashiest resume, 6 years ago, the guy with the flashiest resume was Joe Douglas. When the Jets hired Joe Douglas, everybody was amazed. Everybody was praising them. Joe Douglas was supposed to be the next superstar general manager of in the NFL, and of course, didn't quite work out that way. Not that Douglas, was hard. Not that Douglas did everything wrong. Douglas did quite a few things right, but he wasn't as good as he was made out to be. very difficult to judge these GM candidates. And of course, it's important to have a vision for the salary cap. It's important to understand how to scout personnel. It's important to draft effectively. But the most important thing, and something the Jets have lacked a lot in the past, is a head coach and a general manager on the same page. And ultimately, that's the thing I'm focused on, because there are lots of executives in the NFL who can do those things, who can run the cap effectively, and who can scout well, and who can draft well. The league's full of guys who could do that. The question is whether you can do that within the context of building a team, within the context of working with your head coach to get the players he needs. And that's ultimately what's going to determine whether or not this hiring is a success. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, let's talk about what Darren Mougey needs to do to hit the ground running. And ironically, one of the first people he could look to is the model set out by his predecessor, Joe Douglas, but not the job Joe Douglas did with the Jets. I think Joe Douglas's previous job before he came to the Jets offers a good blueprint for what Darren Mougey can do to rebuild this team. Let's talk about that as we continue here on this special Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. Growing your small business in 2025 comes down to how well you can hire. And let's face it, better hires start with smarter insights. And that's where LinkedIn comes in. With the strongest hiring data available, LinkedIn helps you identify the right candidates, giving you the confidence to make the best decisions possible for your business. Small businesses are wearing a lot of hats, so every hire is crucial, and LinkedIn gets that. That's why they connect you with the best candidates using data you won't find anywhere else. From unique skills and interests to the connections you share, LinkedIn helps you find the right person for the job. In fact, 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn has helped them find high-quality candidates. The Jets used the 33rd team to hire their head coach and general manager. You don't have access to the 33rd team, but maybe LinkedIn could be the 33rd team for you. Hire smarter this year and find your next great hire on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by Prize Picks. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football action, and that's where Prize Picks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money while watching the games, Prize Picks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With Prize Picks, you simply pick more or less on player stats, like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns, for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds, and whether you're looking for a flex player to boost your payout or you want to cash out quickly, Prize Picks has got you covered. And with over 10 million members and billions in winnings, it's clear that people are loving this platform. Here's a special offer for Locked On NFL listeners. Download the app today and use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup at Prize Picks. Again, download the app today and use code Locked On NFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL, to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. Darren Mougey, the next Jets general manager, a guy with a long career working in the Denver Broncos front office, now coming to New York to work hand in hand with Aaron Glenn, hopefully to turn the Jets into a winner. And there are lots of tasks that will be in front of Mougey, but I think the most important task he has is rebuilding the Jets culture. And ironically, I think there's actually a pretty good model for Mougey to follow. And that model was set out by his predecessor, Joe Douglas, with the Philadelphia Eagles. Before Douglas was hired by the Jets in 2019 as their GM, he was the assistant general manager of the Philadelphia Eagles under Howie Roseman. And Douglas received a lot of credit for the Eagles winning the Super Bowl in 2017. When Douglas arrived and Roseman brought him in, the Eagles were at a very bad place culturally. They had just come off the Chip Kelly era, and they had made a lot of big name moves that did not pan out. The organization was just kind of a mess. There was not a lot of chemistry in the locker room. But the Philadelphia Eagles at that point did have a core of homegrown talent. And the Eagles decided to commit to that talent. They gave contract extensions to guys like Zach Ertz and Jason Kelsey, Lane Johnson, Fletcher Cox. And where Douglas got a lot of credit was then building out from that, finding supporting players. And look at the New York Jets right now. Again, a situation where they were coming off a very disappointing era. They made a lot of big name acquisitions that did not work. A lot of these guys created a bad locker room situation. The team culturally is a mess. How do you turn it around? Well, the good news for the Jets is, unlike when Adam Gase was here, unlike when Mike McCagnon was here, unlike when John Idzik was here, there is a base of talent on this team. Now, through much of the last year, people have bemoaned that this Jets team is so talented. How can they not win? If you were saying that the Jets were a team with Super Bowl talent a year ago, I think you were mistaken. And to the extent I said that, I was mistaken. The Jets were not a team with Super Bowl talent, but that's not to say they lacked any talent. They do have a base of talent, and that base of talent is entering the point where the Jets will need to negotiate second contracts. First guy I'd look to is Garrett Wilson, the guy who's unhappy with, and understandably so, with the state of the locker room, with the state of things, with the state of the quarterback situation where Aaron Rodgers was focused more on Devontae Adams than him. Garrett Wilson is now eligible for a contract extension. What a statement it would be if the Jets locked him up long term. This is a guy the Jets should not let get away. If the Jets let Garrett Wilson get away, it's an organizational failure. I don't want to hear like any counter to that. It's an organizational failure if Garrett Wilson is not here long term. Sauce Gardner, who's coming off a bad season, but his first 2 years in the league, he was a first-team All-Pro. Again, a guy you'd want to lock up. And then you have like your second-tier guys. Can the Jets keep Jamie and Sherwood around? Sherwood really blossomed this year. I think it would be a real shame if the Jets spent 4 years developing Jamie and Sherwood, and I know different coaching staff. I know different defensive system they were running, but I think it would be a real shame if Sherwood left after the Jets invested all this time and finally started reaping dividends for some other team to enjoy the fruits of the Jets' labor. Elijah Vera-Tucker, who showed he could stay healthy this year. The question with AVT was always, can he stay on the field? He's always been effective when he's been on the field. That's a guy I think you should try and lock up. And then you have your other guys. Jermaine Johnson, I'd be a little bit more hesitant on just because I want to see how he handles coming off an injury. I don't want another Muhammad Wilkerson situation where the Jets gave Wilkerson a big contract right after he broke his leg, and then he was never really the same player. And then Breece Hall, who is a good back. I think we wanted Breece to be a great back. I don't think Breece is a great back. And also the running back position is one where you got to be careful with investments. Now, the tide has kind of turned on running backs because of everything that happened this year with guys like Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley and Josh Jacobs, guys who got paid. It shows you that the idea that you never give a running back a second contract is probably taking things too far. You should be careful with running backs, though. But if Breece is interested in staying with the Jets and is willing to take a reasonable deal, I think the Jets should be interested. I think as much as anything, Jets need to show that they're a place where people want to be. And I think it would be a big statement if the Jets locked some of these guys up, some of these young guys who have been here through the losing, and despite all that, they want to be here. Well, the only way for the Jets to turn things around is winning. And that tangibly means you need good players. And that means keeping the good players that you have and building out from them, not getting rid of the good players that you have and creating an even deeper hole. But beyond that, you have to change the perception. You have to make people believe New York's a place people want to be. The Jets are a team people want to play for. And the best way to do that is showing that the guys who are already here want to stay here. And that's the first step to changing a culture. And it's ironic because this was not really the way Joe Douglas ran the Jets, but it was the way the Philadelphia Eagles ran when Joe Douglas was the assistant GM, and he's received some credit for that. So to me, that's one of the first things Darren Mougey should look to as he tries to build this team up with Aaron Glenn. Anyway, that's all for our special edition of Locked On Jets today. I hope you have a great weekend, everybody. Stay tuned. We'll be back next week to talk more Jets, and we'll have plenty more on the new Jets general manager head coach partnership. Can't wait to chat with you then.